Hi, and welcome. Thank you for joining us for this DHR webinar. Today is Human Rights Day. It is the final of the 16 days of activism against gender-based violence as well. And we wanted to highlight a very important human rights issue, maybe the human rights issue in Canada right now, which is that of missing and murdered Indigenous women. And specifically, because we're a media organization, obviously, we want to talk about the coverage of those issues. And so we have today a panel of incredible Indigenous women who will all each have helped shape this discourse in their own ways. And I, for one, am very much looking forward to hearing them. So I hope everybody learns a lot and really gains a lot from this discussion. And again, thank you so much for joining us. We will be sending out an email survey after the webinar that we super appreciate if anybody could reply to it. Also, for any families, friends of missing, murdered Indigenous women and girls who are watching with us right now and who might find some of the subject matter difficult, we just wanted to remind everyone that the MMIWG National Inquiry has a toll-free 24-hour, 7 days a week support line that is available in English, French, Cree, Ojibwe, and Inuktitut. The number is 1-844-413-6649. So please, I hope everyone appreciates this and as well. And I'm going to stop talking because I'm not who you came here to see, and I'm going to hand it over to our moderator, Brandi, and our wonderful panelists. Thank you.
Awesome. Tanse Tanike Lee for the introduction. Welcome today. My name is Brandi Morin. I am a Cree, Iroquois, and French mother. I live in Treaty 6, west of Edmonton. I am a journalist who does a national and international work focusing on Indigenous stories. So in Canada, there's estimates of up to 4,000 missing or murdered Indigenous women and girls. This crisis has been ongoing for decades and has been declared a genocide by the National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls. The media's role in this crisis has spread misinformation, endorsed destructive and hurtful stereotypes to the victims, their families, and survivors. Our women are consistently misrepresented or underrepresented in the media, and often characterized as criminals, framed as sex workers, or leading high-risk lifestyles. For example, mainstream media took to victim blaming during the trial of the accused killer of 15-year-old Tina Fontaine, citing Fontaine's use of drugs and alcohol to suggest that she was somehow responsible for her own death. We know the impact the media has on societal views, and things have somewhat changed in MMIWG coverage, but there's still a lot left to fix. Today, our panel includes Karyn Pugliese. She describes herself as a difficult Indigenous woman on Twitter. Karyn is Algonquin, a mother, a journalist, former news director of APTN National News, a 2020 Neiman Fellow, and professor at Ryerson School of Journalism. Welcome, Karyn.
Thank you.
We also have Sheila North, former journalist, former Grand Chief, documentary filmmaker, a survivor and advocate of MMIWG. Sorry, she's also the inventor of the MMIWG hashtag, and she is from the Bunaboni Cree Nation. Did I say it right, Sheila? Okay. And we have Michèle Audette. So Michèle is an Innu French-Canadian mother. She's a politician, a former president of the Quebec Native Women, the Native Women's Association of Canada, and she's also a commissioner for the National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls. So welcome to all of you today. So I'm going to start with you, Michèle. wondering your thoughts on the National Inquiry's recommendations to the media on how to better coverage this issue. Now, I'm going to share screen because we have a PowerPoint presentation to share that Michèle is going to.
Way. While you're doing this, Brandi, I just want to say to Bohoga that Nogasnio te heka de udinu sitten dan wendaki Innu at Quebec malisit mak abenaki. Alors, in Innu, I wanted to acknowledge the people who was here and still here today, and very powerful people. The relationship, I would like to respond to your question to say why finally we were able to have a national inquiry. It's because of the strength, the passion, the tears, the anger, but also the energy, or all kind of a word that I could use that came from families and survivors. So we have to remember that. But also we have to remember that the media, it's a love and a hate story. We could be very in love or very in a respectful way, of course, acknowledging the work of the journalists or the media in general, but also it could devastate an individual or an entire nation. So we were able with this inquiry, during this journey, to show the love and the hate, how friendly it can be, but also an enemy, or how it can break us or help us. So the media had so much pressure on the political party just before a federal election. Finally, the political party said, if I'm your next government, we will have an inquiry. It took a while, but finally we had one. And during that process, we were attacked by media, or we were supported by media. But the most important, it was how families and survivors shared to us, next slide, about what we should put in that report that would come from their words, tears, but also hope and love about how in Canada, for media and social influencer, solution or call for justice, or things that could improve or change de façon, well, even French now, I forget, the change that needs to happen in that, I will say, world. So of course, the women always told us, we have to make sure that we are part of there, that we are well represented, the Indigenous women, the girls, the people with diverse cultural background and so on, and also the Two-Spirit community, to make sure that how can we address the negative, because it's been there forever, and all the stereotype, racism and discrimination. So we collected some evidence, and of course some thought from the families and survivors. Next slide. It's my first PowerPoint, by the way, in 2020, I think so. So, in English also. And of course, we know it's a very, very powerful tool. So we have to make sure that when a media will come and talk about us, that first of all, we're aware that it needs to support the Indigenous people on how we want to share our truth, our story, our way of seeing life, solution, and making sure that also we can break those, when I mentioned the negative part, the bias. Not long ago, we lost a sister that we all saw on Facebook, on social media, her last moment. That same doctor who works for her community, Joyce Eshakwan, she's also a teacher here at Laval University, and how the bias is, unconscious bias is so strong, and I have to be very short and sweet on this because it's very powerful. 200 next doctors that will be here in Quebec or across Canada. They had that question from this person who works in Manawan. There's a young man, 40, he's unconscious, he's Indigenous, and he's got some puke on him, vomit. What do you think happened to him? 200 response was, he was drunk, he was intoxicated. It's young people in their 20s.
Mm.
Very open mind, open spirit, open heart, very nice people. But the media, how it's been perpetrated, our image, it did influence the next generation of next doctors. So we got scared. So next slide. So of course, the women told us to see a change in that important world, culture, and this space, you know, media. And it's a huge, you have a long list, it's your expertise, Brandi. It's to make sure that we have more Indigenous people, we have more Sheila, we have more Karyn, we have more of you, Brandi, and everywhere across Canada, en français, in Inuktitut, in Indigenous languages, English, of course, to make sure that we are the one talking about us, but we can talk about other stuff also. But we have to make sure that the society, this government, and Canada also will make sure that we are providing educational and training opportunities for Indigenous people, of course, but for those who are there now, or the next generation that will leave university and become the next anchor or next journalist, they don't have Indigenous 101, I would say, most of the university across Canada. It should be mandatory. So it was asked. And so we put it in the report. And the final one is to make sure that we're providing scholarship and grant to Indigenous inclusion in media, movies, music industry, and you know what's in that huge important world. So yes, we want more people, but how do we support them and walk beside them to make sure that they didn't get in beside the door, but they got in because they're amazing and good, but also they're there to tell our truth. So it's a part of the work that we did during this amazing inquiry.
Thank you. Thank you for that presentation. So Karyn, just wondering your thoughts on if the media is taking any action on these recommendations. You were also a recent past president of the Canadian Association of Journalists, so I'm sure you're very familiar with a lot of the trends, and also being a journalism professor.
Yeah, I think there's a few things that I just want to talk about out of the report off the top. One of the things that Michèle said, remember, was the families. I can remember when this started, and it was actually Bridget Tolley, I think, who came up with the idea of vigils, for NWAC to hold vigils so that families could get media coverage, because they weren't getting media coverage. And I do remember women standing up on Parliament Hill with, you know, the faces of their lost ones on Bristol board, and reporters walking right by them. And I can remember turning around to one reporter who, she was a good reporter and she covered these issues. And I said, "Are you doing this story?" And she said, "I told my editor." He says no. So that was very early on. I mention that because it was the families who pushed and pushed and pushed. And it does bother me just a little bit when I hear journalists sort of taking credit for that, because journalists will say, "Well, we covered it and we covered it first." Stop that. Please stop saying that. It was the families. The other thing that came out of the report that I thought, I mean, there were recommendations that Michèle can talk about in more detail. One of the important ones to me was just showing us in media when we're not missing and murdered. You know, it seems like we're only in there when we're victims for mainstream media. It's not hard, or it's never been hard for us at APTN, or when I was at APTN, to, I mean, you see a lot of Indigenous women as doctors, nurses, lawyers, leaders, mothers, you know, and just living their lives in their full humanity, because they're who we know. And I think a little more of that in mainstream. You brought up the CAJ, and before I even became president, I reached out to the CAJ, and this is how I got involved with them. I asked them if I could organize a few panels. And one of the panels I wanted to do is I wanted to bring families of missing, murdered Indigenous women in so that they could talk back to reporters and say, "Here's what it's like for me to be covered, and here's what I thought of your coverage." And we did that 2 years in a row. And they were polite. They were truthful and honest. And They were very good at showing what was working well and what wasn't. But it has been, I mean, we did it 2 years in a row, and then you kind of feel it's the same journalists that come every year, so they've seen it. So we kind of haven't done it again. And maybe it's time to go back and at the next one and take a look at both the TRC and the inquiry, the National Inquiry Report.
Thank you. So before I go to Sheila here, I just wanted to follow up with you, Michèle. What have you seen since the release of these calls for justice towards media? Has there been any shift?
Well, I would say sometimes yes, sometimes no. When I will say yes, it's the CBC, Indigenous CBC on the French side. Whoa, suddenly they had a list of position for Indigenous people to apply. And I was like, oh, either I say it's about time, or finally they're responding for many call for action and justice or recommendation, because we're not the first one who is saying this with this the National Inquiry. So it took forever, but do we have an official seat at CBC board at the governance level? Do we have in each region, you know, things like this that also we need to see, and those call for justice talks about those positions. So the shift is not fast enough, I would say. So we need to continue the lobby, the pushing, or the education on that.
Sheila, so you were a reporter for a number of years, and then you went into politics. Oh, she's got her little guy there. So Karyn, you have a little statistics to show us regarding some of the coverage and on missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, and whether that has changed.
Sure, I'll just share my screen here. All right, so what you should be seeing here, I'm using a software called Media Cloud that is at MIT. And what I did is I looked up these sources, CBC, CTV, Globe and Mail, Toronto Star, Global News, and Montreal Gazette. APTN's not in there because it would throw it off, and MIT doesn't have APTN in there. So over the years, and I've color coded it, you're looking at the number of stories on this slide that were covered. And the search terms I used were MMIW, MMIWG, or missing with Aboriginal, or missing and murdered. So it's not going to necessarily capture everything, but it captures a good portion of it. And you can see how that coverage was highest in 2015, 2016, and actually slid off. I'll talk a little bit about why I think that is. Let me just move to the next slide. Okay, this is looking at it, same numbers, but just a little bit different. You're looking at it as a percentage of coverage. So what this does is, instead of as a number of like 10 stories, what it's saying is in the percentage of coverage of what gets covered in Canadian media, what was it? And it never goes over 2% at the highest. So a lot of times we cover these stories and we feel like we cover them and we cover them. But really, in the grand scheme of things, this is why you have things like, with all the coverage that's been done of missing and murdered Indigenous women, Canadians still don't seem to see it. It's easy to miss in all the media that's thrown at them. It's the same thing I would say with residential schools. It's always such a small portion of the coverage, and people have so much coming at them that it's easy to miss. So just the numbers.
Wow.
And here, I just wanted to show you what those peaks are. So as we'll remember, 2015, we have a few things going on. We have Harper's government, who is refusing to call an inquiry on missing women. We've got the TRC, and we've got an election. And then we have the announcement of the inquiry. February 14th is there because, as we know, families organize events on February 14th. So you see a peak there. And that's that same peak that's there at the beginning of 2016. That second peak in 2016, I could not explain. Just for some reason, there like year-end kind of coverage or something. there was just a mishmash of different stories that were being done at that time. So you get a peek. And then you can see it falling off. It kind of weirdly dies. Like there's nothing showing. The percentage of stories are so low right before the inquiry comes out with its report. I will guess that that's because everybody's holding their breath and waiting for the report. So they're not covering anything until they see what the report says. And the levels never pick back up afterwards. Now you can say the pandemic, but you can see that the levels are low already before the pandemic and then just kind of die off in early 2020 when, you know, around March when that pandemic comes up. So that's I mean, you know, it's shocking to look at, but that's the reality of how much it's being covered.
I'm pretty stunned by it, actually. I didn't realize it was that bad. Sheila, what are your thoughts and how have you seen things change over the years?
Wow, yeah, sorry about that. Sorry and not sorry. I have my little grandson with me on most calls and to help my daughter out because I know how important it is as a young mother to support our young mom. So she's doing her thing, I'm doing ours. So I get the chance to hold him on my lap a lot of times. But yeah, that's a very interesting model, Karyn and Michèle and Brandi. Hi, everyone. I'm glad to be here with all of you. Sheila, a elder told me that we have to use our Indigenous languages to honor our sovereignty. So I do that as much as I can when we speak to public. Yeah, and just keeping in mind a little bit of Michèle's perspectives and Karyn's on the coverage and what we saw during the inquiry and even all the way to 2015. I'll tell you, and it's very reminiscent of what Karyn said as well, what I witnessed is in 2005 when I finally got my stuff together to become, you know, to pursue the dreams that I had when I was a kid. I entered journalism in 2005. I started pursuing it in 2003, I guess, after my kids were a little bit older and, you know, I'm a late bloomer. So in 2005, I finished college and I went to work at CBC as an intern. And then I ended up staying for 7 years, but that was 2005. And when I first started in journalism, I was really adamant that I didn't want to be known as an Indigenous reporter. I didn't want to cover stories. I wanted to be like everyone else. I wanted to cover potholes and openings of streets and things like that. I wanted to just be a general reporter. But then when I got into it, I started paying attention and listening to the stories. I started to realize that the perspectives and the things that our own media was saying about us was wrong. So I fast forward and progression, a couple of other things were going on. Women that we talked to in the media started saying, I'm not going to talk to you if you're going to describe my missing loved one as a prostitute or a street worker. Her name is so-and-so, she's a mother, she's a sister, and all these things. So they started pushing back at media. And I remember that distinctly. When I remember going to a vigil where a young girl was found out in the outskirts. And that was my first time that I really realized that this was a phenomenon. And when I started talking to the families and the girls and the friends of the victims, I started to realize that I was a survivor of the issue because we were telling the same stories. We were vulnerable, we were preyed upon, things like that. So when I realized that I was already a journalist, that I was a survivor, this thing kind of just latched onto me and hasn't left me since. Kind of like those, what do you call those things when you walk around in the bush and they stick to you? That's what I feel like had happened. And all the way up until now in my life where I am, the issue has stayed with me. But what I did witness, much like Karyn, women started voicing more, mostly women, a lot of girls, occasionally men, and a few allies at the time. But women started gathering. Sometimes there was 3 women, sometimes there was 3,000. A lot of them brought their babies in their strollers, you know, little kids with them and posters. They made their own posters. And so this kept going on. And for 10 solid years, I noticed here in Winnipeg, women, every time something happened, they would gather and they would honor. And then they would mark all these special occasions to remind the public what was going on. And they did it organically and naturally. Nobody taught them. Nobody they just inspired each other. And then the media started following along and started, listening to what they were saying, because they were saying, again, don't call her a street worker. If you want to cover it, we'll talk to you, but you can't call her a street worker. And so I was part of that, and as a witness to see how that progressed. And to me, it got louder. The voices got louder and louder and louder, all the way up into the 2015 election. And Idle No More helped with that, because the part of the calls was to call an inquiry into missing and murdered Indigenous women. Thoughts on whether that should happen or not. But in the end, of course, we know that it happened, and it became a major election issue. That's why it's interesting to see that bar. It became a major election issue in 2015, and all of the parties had to answer. And one of the few questions, are you going to call an inquiry into missing and murdered women? And it's because of all those women that stood on the streets and marched and walked and never gave up all across the country. Some people we know walked across the country to raise awareness, right? And so I give all the credit to that. And I had the pleasure and the opportunity to go to the UN a couple of times. And I saw a bureaucrat kind of claiming that, we called an inquiry because it was part of the recommendations of TRC. And I had to correct them and stand in public and say, no, that's not why it was called. It was called because women went to the streets. So the narrative was already starting to be where the government was starting to say, we decided to do it because it was the right thing to do. And they threw that media in there as well for making those decisions. It was forced on them.
Thank you. So yes, you talked about these, the families being at the forefront of, changing the narrative, and how the media, the type and amount of coverage. Michèle, I just wanted to speak with you about the responsibility that the media has to learn, to research, to humanitize, our women when covering them. Tell us about the importance of that, from an inquiry point of view, but also as, an Indigenous woman.
So huge. So I will connect again to Joyce Echaquan, the latest, what happened here in Quebec, how media, if they don't decolonize or humanize the approach about who we are and what happened to us, and talking about the spirit of us, not talking about the blood and the numbers and the statistic to sell more media stuff. I'm sure if we have that collectively, and it's also, I dream a legislation in Quebec or Canada, whatever, that it force that industry to have proper training, education, and training done by us for them, not them about us to them. So we are the front, we are the one talking about, exactly of the example that was given by Karyn and Sheila. But if we don't do that, and we don't change how we create or nourish the next people to the media world, we're just going to come back next year and 5 years and 10 years to denounce and denounce. So education has a strong and huge role, but also the industry, or those organizations that is responsible for media, they have to decolonize. They have to change that, and they have to include us in every level, because it won't change if it doesn't happen.
Thank you. So Karyn, I understand you've had the opportunity to speak to some families in regards to, what would help, what they want to see happen. What did they have to say?
Yeah, I've actually got a little list going. So I spoke to Lorelei, and William's out in BC, so I want to give her a shout out. And also Bridget Tolley, who, she's the one, I spoke to her in the spring, and already she's the one who kind of alerted me. Like, I felt like the coverage was dropping off, and she's the one who says we've been forgotten, Wow. So Lorelei reminded me of a research study that had been done by Christine Gilchrist, and I think it gets mentioned in the inquiry as well, where she'd taken a look at 6 stories about Indigenous girls, and she made sure she made sure that they were girls next door, so there was no question of what they did for a living or their class or anything else. And 6 girl next door, white women, and compared how they were covered. And she found the headlines were different. Native girl missing versus Sheila, please come home. Often pictures and a very long bio with like a rich history of the white woman's life, much shorter article. Back when she was looking, it was still newspapers, and she would say like below the fold or, page 6, whereas it gets front page where it's a white woman. And so these are things that I think reporters are getting more conscious of. But I mean, there's been such a drop in coverage, it's really hard to tell. I didn't go back and do any sort of media analysis to see if they'd really been correcting for that. But we've seen times when they've got it right. And you mentioned off the top, Brandi, times where they got it wrong, even when they've been covering so well. Tina Fontaine, how all of a sudden they reversed the story and made her the culprit in her own death. And, reminding everybody that she was just a young girl. A few other things: take time, be willing to push the deadline. The only person you're racing against is like other media. Families need time. They need to know that they can trust you. And Lorelei often gets calls like when a report comes out or something and they go, we need to talk to you. And she has 15 minutes to go over the report. And like, come on, do you want to do good journalism? Like, do you want to do a good story or do you want to do a quick story? You're only rushing this because you're trying to beat another journalist. Give them time to really think about what they're going to say so that it's good information and it's good journalism. And care. This is one of my own that I would often, as young journalists, go in and interview people knowing they were going to be upset, but not knowing what to do about it because I don't have the tools to help them and I'm going to leave. And I started thinking about and reading about what I could do. And I think just informing the person, you may become upset during this interview. This could be hard for you. So I want you to have a care plan. I don't know what's going to trigger you and maybe you'll be fine. But if you want to have somebody there sitting right beside you the whole time, that's fine. And I just want to know that you have somebody to talk to afterwards, just in case. And just remind them of that. And give them a call afterwards and follow up. I mean, you can't, like, our job as a journalist, we don't have the skills to make a person whole or to help them, but we can check in on them and just give them that extra touch, because you are dealing with somebody who's been through a lot. And I don't know if we'll talk about self-care for reporters, but I'll leave that there.
Thank you. So Sheila, what's your approach in regards to, working with families? So you have a film that you did along with a documentary partner. Is it 1200 plus? Is that the name of it?
Yeah, it's called 1200 plus.
1200 plus, and you had to, engage with a number of different families. What was that process like, and what do you recommend?
This documentary, we worked on it for 4 years when I left CTV and then while I was still Grand Chief. So it took me a long time, it felt like, to finish, me and my film partner, Leonard. And most of the people that we talked to, thankfully, were contacts I've had over the years. And we didn't get to put everyone in the film that I wanted, and not everything that I really wanted to tell made it into the film because I had to give up a lot of the direction for my partner because he had more time to do it. But our approach was always what Karyn just said, is giving people time, giving people space and ability to have time to look at and consider what they want to say. But I know day-to-day reporting, that doesn't always happen, and we can't always do that. And while I appreciate what you're saying, Karyn, about reporters having to call someone on cue and then have them ready, I've been on both ends of it, and I get that media is like that and media is changing. There were times where I felt like I had to touch base with people I've done stories on, even if it wasn't related to MMIW. I would call them and see, are you okay with the story? And I got my hand slapped for doing that, because we're supposed to be unbiased. We're supposed to be, detached. But I think media is changing, and it should be more humanistic and have that value that we actually care about the stories that we talk about. And I think the more we do that, the more the public will start to care as well, more and more. But I also think that, unfortunately, what media covers and how it covers it, all these decisions are made to cater to what the public wants in the end. So media is a microcosm of what Canadian society is thinking, feeling, acting, doing. So while we're seeing the problems firsthand in the media, or how police act, or what we see in the hospitals, this is truly what our value base is in Canada, unfortunately. And so it's a chicken and egg thing. Who's going to make the changes first, the public, the media, or the systems, or both? And it falls a lot of times on Indigenous people to do the teaching on both, to say they're both important, change them at the same time. And I truly believe that's the transition we're in right now, even though it's hard. It has to be hard. Truths have to be told. And yeah, so I believe that that's where we're at.
So, Michèle, I'm just wondering, what are your thoughts on the impact that the media can play on this crisis? How big or an important of an impact is it?
It is huge, because as we speak right now, for the first time in the Francophone community across Canada, we have the Assembly of First Nation Quebec and Labrador, as we speak right now, having a seminar or webinar with major media, Francophone media. We're very traditional, or very, one nation, I would say. There's a debate right now. There's an interesting open debate where they want to do the shift. It's new for us. It's new. The other shift also, remember how many of our people across Canada, you covered those stories, other Indigenous reporter and Canadian reporter, about a family or many families, and it didn't hit, the national news, or it didn't create what we hope that it create. It does help a family, because speaking is healing also. But we have also videos, or sell, iPhone video of George Floyd dying, in the state, and it become a huge movement. Black Lives Matters. Boom. Meanwhile, same time, we have this Innu who is hit by RCMP truck, and it doesn't create that wave. So thousands of voices were silenced until we have this situation here in Quebec, where Quebec for a long time believed it's only an Anglophone or English things, or somewhere across Canada, but not here. It awake the people. So now
You're talking about when Joyce Echaquan was killed. Okay.
Exactly. Sorry. Yeah. So about what she did and how the media, the French media, reacted. But we had stories like that way before also, but they weren't.
But do you believe it was the media that caused enough pressure for them to now be doing it?
It did. It took control. They took our narrative for this time. Is it just this time? I'm sensitive. I hope not, but it did change.
Yeah. Wow. So I have a question that I want to actually talk to you about, Karyn. It's in my notes. A couple of back-to-back ones, but it's in regards to your advice for reporters when interviewing victims. It's not like interviewing politicians. Some tips, please.
Yeah, I mean, I think you've got to treat this differently. There's this thing where reporters, like, they're afraid of becoming unbiased. And, I mean, sure, when you're interviewing a politician, you don't give them questions in advance. You don't, there's so many things that you don't do. You keep a wall between yourself. But now you're dealing with somebody who's a victim. Yeah, give them the questions in advance. Why not? This is not somebody who's going to try to trick you. It's somebody who just needs more time to think, and you're trying to create a place where they can be comfortable. take a lot of time with them. One of the things that Lorelei reminds us of is about truth. And there are two things that she said about truth. One, just kind of touching on something Michèle said, is don't trust the police. We've known, it's come up in you know, the inquiry into the serial killings in Vancouver. It's come up in the missing and murdered Indigenous inquiry. It's come up, you know, like just in regular reporting by CBC, when you look at the number of Indigenous or Black people who are killed by police, the higher numbers, it's again and again and again. So part of that is believe the families. For so many years, families would come to the media and say the police are not doing everything they could. And people would go to the police and say, oh, you know, they think it's like on the movies, you know, like we're doing everything we can. And so often they weren't. And that really came out in the BC inquiry. I think also give the family a bit of control over the story. And follow them where it goes. I think one of the best examples of this was, if anybody hasn't heard, Connie Walker's podcast on Finding Cleo. You really should listen to that as a perfect example. She spends, I mean, of course it's very long, but you need to push for more space on the story. You need to push for more time with the family. And you need to show that entire truth of what has happened to the family and to the woman to lead to the circumstance that they're in. That's what the National Inquiry tried to do. It's not just the event that happened. There are a whole series of things that happen to women to create the circumstances that hurt us.
Thank you. So, Sheila, there is some good news in this. You pointed out earlier that Canada is leading the discussion on this issue. Talk a little bit about that and what you've seen.
Absolutely. What I said at the beginning of myself as a witness from the 2005 up until now, and seeing the women push and getting this, when I ended up going to the UN twice on you know, an invitation of the IIWR, Institute for, I can't remember, Women's Rights. Yeah, anyway, we were talking about women's issues at the UN twice, and I have to say that people in the States, women in the States, India, even in the Asian countries, they were coming to us after our presentations and looking and saying to us, how did you make this a national election issue? What did you guys do? And I would tell them the whole story about the babies and the 3 and the 3,000. And I said it was just sheer force of Indigenous women and girls and families, survivors and allies and advocates that made it happen. And that is something to celebrate, even though we're still trying to rectify and put an end to the problem and end to the issue and empower our women. And I think it's happening now. We can celebrate a little bit that we have forced the issue. We were there in 2015. Nobody now could say that this issue is not important anymore. I remember a time when leaders, female leaders, would tell me that back in the day, even before 2005 and in the early 2000s, women were told to take the issue of murdered and missing women or violence against women away from the chief's table, go somewhere else to another room and talk about it. We're literally told that. So I don't think you'll find a chief circle say that ever again. I certainly hope not, and we'd probably hear about it. You know, that is the good news of it. Women are starting to feel empowered and protected, even though the news coverage might be changing a little bit. I think that there is some strength. I think, you know, I have a little bit of faith that something good's going to come out of the implementation of the report, because there are real women and real warriors in the mix that are making the recommendations. And that's where I find hope. And now we're seeing the issue and the stories picking up in the States. And once that happens, I mean, I credit the Canadian Indigenous women, or Indigenous women from this country, I should say, that for getting awareness out, and that's the good news of it. And sometimes when I'm feeling down, or I find women that are feeling down, I remind them of that the work, even though it's hard, they've done a lot to raise awareness. And so I feel hopeful that change is coming, but I think more to support that change and push it even further. And allies are also very important in the mix as well.
Hi. So, Michèle, wondering, do you know where the National Action Plan is currently at? And after that, how do you hope the media will cover the rollout of that?
I don't know exactly where the National Action Plan is at, but I saw, because of social media or because of Messenger, to be honest, we're still connected with some family members across Canada who are involved in those working group or circle of people in different field, and one is with the family members. So I'm glad to know there is strong warriors involved and making sure that they are working on that. So very, very anxious to see the result, like all of us, I hope. And I would say the media doesn't really cover, and I'll try to be very calm, because I got very mad or sensitive when we knew that if we're giving and tabling the report a couple months before a federal election, it was the worst thing to do, because we would be diluted to the rest of what's the next, campaign and da 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 da. So I was very, very sensitive about that. And yesterday, one of the call for justice, it was asking the Quebec government to have an inquiry and also have a special unit that will provide information of all those families who lost the babies when they brought them to the hospital, or they were taken without the consent to the hospital, and they never came back. Okay, there's a new legislation, and I hope they'll have a consultation and da 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 da. But only 2 media was there: an Indigenous media, awesome woman, and a Quebecois who lives just beside my community, who knows about the Innu people. So she was very sensitive, and she even said to the government, how many media are here?
Wow.
Why aren't they so, covering this? It's huge. It's one of the call for justice. And poof, we didn't hear after. So of course, I acknowledged those 2 women. I said, merci. And I encouraged the other media to do the same. But 2020, it's not enough.
So you encourage people to follow those calls for justice, and keep pressure, in their work as journalists.
What?
Is that what you're saying?
What I'm saying, Osi, just remember that those calls in my world was, I'm not a writer. I listen. So I try to bring in that report the voice of the women and the families and the survivors. Not perfect, but now we have to honor that. We have to honor that as an individual, but also as a society, or as movement or groups or government, etc., where we fit or we want to fit. We have to honor that. That's how I feel.
Thank you. Well, I feel a little bit discouraged seeing Karyn's chart of the coverage, because I thought things were getting better. So Karyn, what do we have to do to, bring these issues more, to the forefront of what's it going to take?
I think that, first of all, at this point, it's shocking to me when an Indigenous woman goes missing. That is not just front page news and for days, because we see that when other people go missing, right? So, I mean, knowing everything that's happened, it should be. I think there's some bias up there clearly at the editorial level. One of the most disgusting things about that I've seen media do was when the word genocide was mentioned, how they stopped covering the report and all just said, "How dare you embarrass Canada by you?" That was disgusting. And it was clearly written by editors who had not read the report and had probably even barely read their own coverage in their own newspapers. And I was very pleased to see reporters in the newsrooms gang up against their editors and make them change the story. Having said that, there's a lot more in the report for the inquiry than just what government has to do. There were calls for legal societies. There were calls for other actors in the Canadian society to do things. And so all of those can be stories. If you can't figure it out, give me a call. I used to assign stories. I can assign you a dozen stories right now that you could be covering, because it didn't end with the inquiry. It doesn't end until society changes and the things that are hurting us are fixed.
So I have a request, Karyn. Thank you for you to share self-care for reporters.
Yeah, and I will say apology to the reporters that worked for me, because I got this wrong so much. So to the bosses out there who are in the position that I was, where I was assigning these stories, and having covered, years of this stuff myself, you kind of get a shell, and you kind of, I think the report also says, Indigenous women, we normalize violence. So that's the first thing. I don't always recognize the situation I'm sending my reporters into, because I normalize violence. I have had violence in my life, as we all have, as Indigenous women. When the reporters go out, what gets put in the newspapers is sanitized and made fit to print. The details that they're hearing over and over again, what the cameramen who are with them are seeing, what the editors are playing and rewinding and playing and rewinding as they edit. They're sometimes hearing these things multiple times, and they're hearing a lot worse than what the public knows goes on. Sure. So bosses need to be told that. You need to, when you're a reporter and you're in that situation, you really need to be able to take advantage of the services your bosses or your services your newsroom offers, because there are these health services. You need to be clear in communicating with your boss how bad it is, because we don't do that. And you do have to advocate for yourself. And bosses, you need to pay attention, because your reporters won't advocate for themselves.
Hi. Sheila, I'm just wondering if you have any advice for journalists, both Indigenous and non, that are watching, just in a couple of minutes, if you have some advice.
When I covered the Phoenix Sinclair inquiry, I ended up having PTSD. I had vertigo and shingles right after. And during the whole time, I would absorb all the information I was hearing in court, and then only report 10% of the horrific things that happened to poor little girl here in Manitoba. If you don't know that story, you can Google it. But I had to cover that story, and every night when I would go home, I wouldn't even eat. I'd go into a fetal position and try to get images out of my head of this little girl. And then I got really sick, and I didn't really pay attention to what I was doing to myself and to my body, because I thought it was so important and I wanted to do it and do a good job. Yeah. But I ran myself ragged, and I didn't recognize it until it was too late. So I think we have to listen to our body and our cues and take those breaks here and there, or, let yourself break down. There's a couple of times when I did a story and I was a commentator on something, and actually was that time right after the Phoenix Sinclair inquiry was the kickoff to TRC here in Winnipeg at the Forks. And I was doing a live hit for CBC, trying to explain the atmosphere and all that stuff. And I broke down because I was still thinking about what happened to this little girl. And then everything we're talking about TRC was all impacting me. And I broke down. And there was a couple of times I back and forth and thinking I was embarrassed that I broke down. But at the same time, I'm thinking, well, I guess, we're all human. And so I think we have to pay attention, much like any other field. I think we're also on the front lines as journalists, covering what's going on and the trauma, but all this but also all the celebrations. But, you know, we absorb a lot of things, and then we don't find a way to heal ourselves all the time, and we have to.
Yeah,
Just,
for sure.
I just want to add, because I didn't say it earlier, just as, you know, like you're going in, you're telling the families have a care plan, reporters have a care plan. You know you're going to go out in a story and that it could be very upsetting. So have a self-care plan, have, you know, like know that when you go home, you have somebody there that you're going to talk to, even if it's just a friend, that maybe you've made your meal in advance, that maybe you're going to go out and do something that takes your mind off of it, but have a care plan, whatever it is that individually helps you.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, and take a breather. If you've been working and working and working, it's really important to take that time off and time out to reset. I had to do that this summer, and I didn't want to, because like Sheila said, you want to work and work and work and work because you want to do it, and because there's not many of us out there in our positions that are doing so that you think that you're missing out. But the story will be there when you get back. You really need to take care of yourself physically, mentally, you know, spiritually. Sheila, I see you had.
I was going to say, and editors and bosses in newsrooms also need to recognize that. And I'm sure they do for other things, but sometimes maybe they don't associate that. It's hard to do stories of missing and
I think that they should be like sensitive to that, or understanding of when people are covering Indigenous stories. 90% of them are trauma stories, trauma-based. So I think that they should, understand that things are going to be different for us. They're not the same kind of, if it's a beat that you're covering, it's not going to be the same as somebody else who's reporting in mainstream, right? So that's good advice.
More and more caring people that are in these positions, but definitely we need more, and we need also the Indigenous perspective in all of these positions.
And when yes. This person covering these stories, you know, we're accountable back to our communities. Non-Native person goes in and messes it up, they're not going to remember. Indigenous person goes in, they will never forget that you did that. So we have a higher level of accountability and responsibility. And, I think also, just some of the things that you said, Brandi, I was, I'll leave it there.
Michèle, I was just wondering if you had any words of encouragement or words of advice for journalists or media personnel that are watching.
Oh my God, there's so many, but one that comes now, you have that magic, you have that amazing power that could help one or thousands of people to find their truth, because it's a right. We deserve to know what happened. We deserve to know why and how, and you're part of the healing process. And if the right is done with an open mind, open spirit, and knowing that you don't know everything, it's already okay. And if you're capable to accept that I can laugh at you and about you, Innu humored, I mean, we need you. We need journalists. We need people in media to change how people see us, because we're amazing, we're powerful, we're beautiful, resilient. And yes, it is tough, but look where we're at today. Mm-hmm. And I know you're part of the solution. I do need you. So this is what I would say.
Hi. Well, thank you. Our time is up, but it always seems like it goes way too fast when you are, getting on a train of discussion. But I thought it went very well, and I'm thankful for each and every one of your contributions today. It's such a blessing that we get to come together and do this on Human Rights Day, because this is a human rights issue. Again, keep up all the amazing work that you're all doing, and we will hopefully, continue these discussions going forward. So thank you.
And I love journalism as much as I love other things, but journalism is in my heart.
Thank you.
Journalists, bye.
I'm not sure if we're supposed to log out or if we're getting logged out. We're probably still live. Oh, I'm going to, I forgot about a survey reminding viewers to go to the survey after the webinar to fill that out. And also there is the National Inquiry Support line number for anybody who needs that support, mental, emotional wellness support, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And it's available in English, French, Cree, Ojibwe, and Inuktitut. It's 1-844-413-6649. And again, thank you. Hi.